2010, the 16th Annual Book Symposium at RUTGERS Newark. The last speaker, Steve Sachs, letterpress historian.
The first printing in North America took place about 200 miles northeast of here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. John Winthrop's diary for 1638 mentions that the first press in what is now the United States was set up in the house of the president of Harvard College, Henry Dunster. The type to print books and other output of this press was brought over from England and from Holland. This is a piece of type excavated in the Harvard yard a few years ago. A lowercase italic L shown next to the printed letter in the Indian grammar printed in 1666. And this is a page of John Eliot's 1663 Indian Bible, which was the first Bible printed in North America. In the 18th century, there were a few sporadic attempts to supply printers with typecast locally, but none of these enterprises succeeded. The colonies remained completely dependent on type imported from Great Britain, with some little from the Netherlands or France. From about 1740 on, the largest supplier of type to the colonies was the foundry of William Caslin of London. In this view of the Caslin foundry in 1750, with an out-of-scale hand mold in the foreground, the workmen included 4 casters, 1 rubber, 1 dresser, and 3 boys breaking off the jets. The first step in making type came well before the casting process. A skilled engraver cut punches, reverse letters at the end of a steel bar. Oops, these were then driven into a black piece of copper to the proper depth to make a strike, which is the second image there. Then the strike was justified by having the displaced metal file flat. The strike has now become a matrix. And finally, a piece of type cast from the matrix with the jet still attached to it. When placed in the bottom of a hand mold, the matrix became the cavity in which each letter was cast. The casting, shown here in an English print of 1805, was done at the rate of about 200 text-sized types cast per hour, or about 2,500 a day. The workmen filled a long-handled spoon with molten type metal, a mixture of lead, antimony, and tin, and poured it into the opening in the type mold. At the same time, with his left hand, he jerked the mold upwards to force the molten metal into the finer crevices of the matrix. The metal cooled quickly and was ejected from the mold. In this American print of 1834, we can see women in an adjoining room in the process of breaking off the unwanted jet from the casting and rubbing the side of the type smooth on a flat stone. Caslin's types were in most print shops in the colonies. His types are instantly recognized in the Declaration of Independence. In this modern resetting of the type, we can see what the page looked like in metal to the printer. Because it took months to resupply a print shop in the colonies with type from Britain, printers were accustomed to borrowing from and lending to each other. And some ingenious printers like Benjamin Franklin and Isaiah Thomas contrived a way of casting occasional sorts with materials that they had on hand. Printing was done on the wooden common press, as it had been for centuries before. At the time of the Revolution, the population of Philadelphia was about 23,000, larger than that of either New York or Boston. So it was not surprising that in 1796, 2 Scottish emigres went to Philadelphia to establish what was to become the first successful American type foundry. One of them, Archibald Binney on the left, had worked as a type founder in Edinburgh and brought with him to America type founding tools valued at $888 and a working knowledge of the process of casting type. His partner was another Scot, James Ronaldson, a baker, who invested $888 of his own money. The first specimen book by Binney and Ronaldson, and therefore the first in the United States, was issued by them in 1812, 16 years after they went into business. The foundry they established flourished, and when Binney retired in 1815, he sold his share of the foundry to Ronaldson for $62,000. By the end of the 19th century, their foundry had become the largest in America, McKellar, Smiths, and Jordan. Eventually, competition sprang up in New York. L.E.U. White moved there from Hartford with the idea of casting from 20 to 30 types at once. He obtained a patent on this device, which it turned out was unworkable. He did not actually know how to cast types in the usual way and had never seen a traditional hand mold. The only printed information about the process was in Moxon's Mechanic Exercises, printed in 1683, and there were few, if any, copies of that book in America. Undaunted, White sent a skilled mechanic named Edwin Starr to Binney and Ronaldson in Philadelphia. Starr posed as a disgruntled employee and offered to tell them all about White's new process for casting multiple types at once in return for a job. On the same day, a letter arrived from L.E.U. White warning Binney and Ronaldson to have nothing to do with Starr. And so, of course, they hired him. He stayed long enough to memorize the details of the common type mold. Then he left, taking with him the secret of practical type founding back with him to White's foundry in New York. Here are pages from L.E.U. White's earliest type specimen, or one of his earliest type specimens, in Van Winkle's Printer's Guide of 1818. His foundry flourished, and after this, one by one, other founders entered the market. David and George Bruce, this is George, two more Scots, successful printers in New York, began type founding in 1813. By 1818, they also included their specimen in Van Winkle's Printer's Guide. The first steps towards ornamented types are seen here in the form of traditional letter forms made into fat faces, and in their 1820 specimen book, shaded and decorated faces. This is their 1820 cover of their 1820 specimen. Some people may recognize what we call thorn shaded, which is basically a traditional letter made fat and empty in the middle. And then they decided to start decorating the interiors, and so they just added flowers and decorative patterns. L.E.U. White was energetic and ambitious. After his foundry was operating successfully in New York, he established foundries in Boston and Cincinnati. He began the Boston type foundry in Charlestown in 1817, but sold it within a year or so to members of the book trade. This is the cover of the Boston type foundry 1820 specimen, and that's the back cover of it. By the year 1828, when White established a branch in Cincinnati in the same year, it was the first foundry to recognize the westward movement of people and industry. By the year 1828, there were 14 foundries along the eastern seaboard and one in Cincinnati. Then in the following years, new foundries were started as western branches of established houses. This is from the 1820 Boston foundry specimen. More decoration in the interiors of the letter, plus the drop shadow. By now, the old iron hand press, the old common press, the wooden press, had been superseded by the iron hand press. This is a familiar acorn-shaped frame. We're now in the decade of 1830 to 1840. L.E.U. White had long been obsessed with the idea of mass-producing type, and he is said to have invested over $50,000 in several attempts to invent machines to cast type. He backed the development of a typecasting machine patented in 1831 that was workable, but produced type that was very porous, from 15 to 25% lighter than hand-cast type. It could not stand up well to the pressure of letterpress printing and was never able to overcome this fatal defect. But clearly, the automatic casting of type was coming closer to realization. The great breakthrough came in 1838 when David Bruce Jr., over on the right, an experienced founder in the New York foundry of his uncle and his father, patented the Bruce pivotal typecaster. This was the first automatic casting machine that could produce solid type. When he patented a substantial improvement in 1843 and 1845, the Bruce foundry declined the new machines, and David instead took it to friends at the Boston Type Foundry. There the machine got a thorough testing. It succeeded admirably, and thus the Boston Type Foundry became the agency by which machine type casting spread quickly through the United States and Europe. The Bruce caster could produce an average of 100 text types a minute, while a man with a hand mold could cast no more than about 15. Larger ornamented faces were produced at a slower rate because the larger amount of molten metal cooled more slowly. Here in a drawing that looks to me as if it were by Edward Gorey, we see Bruce's improved 1845 casters in operation at the Boston Type Foundry. As late as 1879, when the drawing was made, they had not yet been fitted for steam operation, but were cranked by hand. And recently, through Google's image search, I was able to identify the foundry worker who made this drawing, the man on the right, whose name is William A. Robinson. His great-granddaughter has a blog entry about him. And this is a later oil painting that he made of the same scene, and I think it's about the only color image of the interior of a 19th century type foundry that I've ever run across. The time was ripe for the typecasting machine, and its use spread rapidly. In 1848, Miller and Richard was the first British foundry to install a machine. Within 25 years of its invention, there were 125 of them in use in New York City alone, and no doubt a large number of these were in the Bruce foundry, which had rejected the improved machine when it was first offered to them. This is a wood engraving from 1880, shows the Farmer Little foundry in New York.